ahead and kind of kick things off a little bit here. My name is Liz Kirchhoff, and I'm an adult services librarian with the Barrington Area Library. And I wanted to thank you all for coming to join us tonight for our program. Before we start, I wanted to ask you all to leave your microphones off and also your video off. It helps for the bandwidth. So if you can shut that off, that would be fantastic. We'd really appreciate it. We will have some time for questions at the end, and we'll unmute all of your microphones at the end so that you can go ahead and ask whatever it is that you had to ask for our presenter. If you wanted to ask for clarification on something while we're talking, you can always use the reactions on the side to raise your hand or to do it that way. So now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Esther Peters. She's the Associate Director at the Center for East European and Russian Eurasian Studies at the University of Chicago. Sorry, I always have to look at it. And she's going to talk a little bit about our program tonight, as well as her program at the University of Chicago. And she's going to introduce our speaker for the evening. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it on over to you, Esther.
Thank you very much, Liz. And thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. So as Liz mentioned, I am the Associate Director at the Center for East European and Russian Eurasian Studies. That is quite a mouthful. We also go by the acronym of CERES, C-E-E-R-E-S, which is also a great way to find us online. You can find us at ceres.uchicago.edu. You can also email us at ceres@uchicago.edu. So if you're interested in Eastern Europe, Russia, Central Asia, please get in contact with me either on our website or through email. We'd be happy to connect you with other programming or resources that we're working on. We do a variety of outreach and other types of activities, especially once the academic year kicks off, although still virtual in the coming months. Tonight's lecture is part of the University of Chicago Global Lecture Series, which was established by the Centers for East Asian, East European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies and the Middle Eastern Studies with the goal of connecting local schools, community centers, and libraries with speakers who can present on diverse and important international issues from our respective world regions. Within that, tonight's lecture, Uncovering a Lost Civilization, Archaeology and the Bronze Age, will be presented by Teagan Wolter. Teagan is a PhD candidate in Near Eastern Art and Archaeology in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. She has a BA in Anthropology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a Master's in Middle Eastern Studies from the University of Chicago. Her dissertation examines the political economy of the Oxus Civilization, which you will be learning about this evening. In that dissertation, she focuses on the field site Tolgoluk 1. Hopefully I got that right. If not, I'm sure Teagan is about to correct my pronunciation. So thank you for joining us, and I'm going to turn you over now to Teagan.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to the Barrington Area Library for hosting this event, as well as Ceres for allowing me to be one of their presenters. I am just going to start sharing my PowerPoint with you. So hold on just a moment. And as was said before, if you have, we're going to do questions at the end, but if you have anything is unclear in the middle, don't hesitate to raise your hand or use one of the numerous buttons in the participant window to indicate that if something is unclear. So we will be discussing how archaeologists uncover civilizations that are more or less lost. So the Oxus Civilization was an ancient society which appeared in the Murghab Delta region in Turkmenistan around 2300 BC. It's also known as the Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex due to its location in these ancient oases of Bactria, which is in modern Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Afghanistan, and Margiana, which is modern Turkmenistan. So the area we are talking about is here, the intersection of these countries here, and then also over in Turkmenistan. The people of the Oxus Civilization built villages, towns, and cities in an area that hadn't been occupied in over 1,500 years. Their cities were fortified with massive walls, and they created an impressive array of artifacts, largely out of bronze and imported stones. And one example of this is here. But the real question is, how do we know this? How is it that archaeologists go about discovering this so-called new civilization, and how do we learn things about it, and how can we be confident in those assertions? So in this talk, we're going to focus in on that and really think about what archaeologists do and how we know what we know. And then we'll get into it with this example of the discovery of this new civilization, and also examine how the various backgrounds of archaeologists play into the different ways they study and different interpretations they make. So to start with, archaeology, once the slide changes, is the study of the human past based on material remains. So importantly, people frequently get archaeology and paleontology confused. So archaeologists focus on humanity. Paleontologists do dinosaurs. It's the Indiana Jones Jurassic Park split. We're in Indiana Jones territory. So it also has, excuse me 1 second, okay. Overlap with history. And I apologize for where the laser pointer is. I can't seem to move it. Okay, there. Overlap with history in studying the past. However, it differs, as history is based very much on the textual record of the past, whereas in archaeology, while some archaeologists do study regions where you do get texts, the field itself largely focuses on these material remains. The principal way of doing that is through excavation. So we can see here, we have these little ivory friezes sitting just in on the dirt, having been covered up, and then more extensive pictures of excavation. And so ultimately, we're left with, we base things on material traces, but just seeing a single artifact or even a few artifacts by themselves isn't very meaningful. We have to put those artifacts into context, and that context can be a historical context that we already understand, and it can also be within the context of other archaeological finds. So to make this a little more concrete, take a modern example. So I think most of us, if asked what this is, could identify it. It's the layout of an apartment, or possibly part of a small house. We have a dining area, a kitchen, some kind of open room, and looks like a washer and dryer. But if we really step back and think about it, how do we know what it is? In this example, it's fairly obvious to most of us what it is, since our houses look roughly like that. If we just use the example of one room, take the kitchen, we know what goes in a kitchen, and we know that this is a stove, and that's a sink, and probably this one's a refrigerator with counters, possibly, that have cupboards beneath them. But if we didn't have kitchens, if we just found this setup, what are the ways we might understand it? We could look at, right now we have a lot of TV and movies that frequently depict kitchens, and they always show people cooking food in them. I'm sure there are paintings of kitchens. They're described in books. So there are all these ways that we could come to the conclusion that this is a kitchen, even if we ourselves did not have a kitchen that looks like this. But if we, project ourselves into the far future and everyone just presses a button and food appears, so there are no more kitchens and we can no longer watch our movies or read our books. If we think about it, what are the ways we could reconstruct that this is a kitchen? We have, here is a thing that is likely to have some evidence of burning, maybe perhaps not a scorch mark, but some evidence of there being something hot on it. Here there are pipes, there's water, and here we have a metal box that has food in it. So if you imagine finding this after it was abandoned, you would have evidence of burning here, probably evidence of water here, and then these things, and assuming they have cupboards below their counters, like many people do, just filled with pots and pans. And this box possibly with leftover food in it. So you can kind of put together that, okay, this box has food in it. Here's a thing that we know had some kind of fire or heat activity. Humans cook their food almost universally, or at least universally cook some kind of food. And here we have pots and pans, and if we tested them, you could probably find, trace residues that are similar to the type of food found in the fridge. And then if we found enough of those, even if sometimes, let's say, these cupboards had nothing in them, or there was nothing in this metal box where the food usually is, we might still be able to say, okay, this looks like all the other times we found this. Therefore, maybe these people cleaned it out before the house was abandoned. So we can understand it, firstly, because of our cultural context, in that, the reality is we all have some kitchen looking thing. Even as a college freshman, I had a mini fridge and a microwave that was kind of kitchen-esque. And then if we have the benefit of having historical documents, we might be able to connect it up. But lacking that, if we see the same pattern over and over and see the different associated finds, we can still start to construct what it may have been, even without the context of current cultural trends or a historical record to give us that. So we're going to explore how this works in real life using the example of the Central Asian Bronze Age, if my slide would ever change, which, as we discussed before, it's known alternatively as the Oxus Civilization or the BMAC. Sorry, just one moment. I'm not sure why my slide isn't changing. Okay, so we're going to somewhat at least divide it up into 4 broad periods of understanding. We're going to talk about early archaeology and what its goals and premises were, and sort of why this complex remained undiscovered for the first 150 years of archaeology. Then we'll discuss the actual discovery of the BMAC, which takes place over the course of the 1950s through 80s, and its early interpretation largely by a small group of Soviet scholars, and then how that interpretation changes as different scholars come in from different backgrounds and start picking apart sort of the initial narrative that's created. So, first of all, Central Asia. It is roughly the stands, so Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, possibly also including Afghanistan. And the areas we're focused on, as I mentioned earlier, are Bactria, which is sort of in this area, actually this smaller area where these countries intersect, and Margiana, or the Murghab Delta, which is kind of by Mare in Turkmenistan. And we'll be really focusing in on what's going on in Turkmenistan, and particularly at the largest site in that region. So early archaeology is really interested in the historical record and essentially finding the material remains of the historical record that's already known. Archaeology in this time is described very much as the handmaiden of history, and this fills roughly the 19th and earliest parts of the 20th century. So not only, well, firstly, people are really looking for these like great civilizations that are already known through texts. So the Middle East becomes a place of great exploration, which is already known through biblical texts. And you have people, interested in the classical world, particularly in the example I gave you to illustrate this, are Schliemann's excavations at Troy. A German scholar essentially read the Iliad very closely and attempted to reconstruct where he thought Troy should be, and then found a site that may have been Troy. It seems he put it forth as it's a fairly likely candidate. And essentially what he did there, as we can kind of see in this picture, is dug a big hole, and you can see this, I think, is meant to be an architectural remain, so of a large building. Here's a wall, but it was very much a time of almost treasure hunting in archaeology. You really want to get to the good stuff. So you want to find the palace, you want to find the temple, you want to find giant statues. People are also interested not only in things that like we still have a textual tradition of, but they start interpreting Egyptian hieroglyphics and Mesopotamian cuneiform. And once they have those, there's a big push to then excavate more sites that will, give you not only the great monumental buildings and great statues, but also give you more texts to read. So then you can start creating a history based on ancient documents. And in this, Central Asia is largely looked over. It has very minimal sort of obvious impressive finds. And also because we're interested in history, and specifically Western history, Central Asia is not that interesting. But we do have some scholarly interest there, especially because it was essentially the field for the great game between the Russian and British empires. So both of them wanted to extend their influence in the area and were perfectly happy to, let scholarship be one way to extend influence and knowledge of Central Asia when it came to their sort of campaigns of empire building. So for us, the most important is this man R.L. Stein. He's actually a Hungarian-born scholar trained in Germany, but he moves to Great Britain and becomes kind of entrenched in the colonial structure there, spends some time teaching in India, and then eventually goes on 4 campaigns in Central Asia. Most of them are focused on what was called at the time Chinese Turkestan, so the far western frontier provinces of China, but also goes up into Iran and into the rest of Central Asia, and he's largely interested in finding texts. His main focus is Indo-European languages, but he also finds some Turkic texts. So, as people may or may not know, Indo-European languages, which we'll talk about in depth, or in a little bit of depth later, are languages spoken, English is an Indo-European language, so is Hindi. What we're really talking about with his interests are largely Farsi or Persian texts, as well as some old Sanskrit ones. And he does do some excavation in Iran. We're still, just kind of coming in and trying to find what's most interesting and taking it away to Britain to, be part of their museum collections. And also, Central Asia is a bit more difficult than the Middle East for just discovering sites, because in the Middle East you have continuous occupation over centuries, so you get these artificial hills that form, and Central Asia mostly doesn't have this. It's there are mountains and things that are natural, but it's archaeologically quite flat. And most of it is in fact just a flat terrain. So where we really get interest taking off is once we get into the Soviet period. So right when the Soviet Union starts up, you have a lot of interest in doing a scientific archaeology, but one that's ultimately trying to discover different phases in this Marxist narrative of human development. So they're interested especially in the steppe and also Eastern Europe, and finding different levels of cultural complexity. However, around in the 40s, and especially after World War II, you get a shifting focus onto the national histories of the various republics within the Soviet Union. So they're less interested in categorizing cultures based on what stage of development they are, and more interested in creating these nationalisms and a sense of deep history of these different republics, and also showing where different ethnic groups are from, what their practices were like in the past, and really getting into questions of where do these groups begin. There's also a focus on migration as an explanatory model for these. So culture changes frequently based on large migrations. Generally, as with migration as this explanatory model, they're really talking about a more mass migration. So whole people groups or substantial parts of them moving from place to place, or occasionally smaller groups, but normally in the context of conquest, which will become important when we discuss where the BMAC comes from. So to discuss this Bactrian Margian archaeological complex, or Oxus Civilization, what you're primarily discussing is the work of this man, Victor Sarianidi, and then also other people's reactions to his work. So he was, I believe his family was Greek, but he's ultimately trained early on in Central Asia and then gets his PhD in Moscow. And he's not in charge of the first survey projects that discover the BMAC, but he's involved with them as a student. And he would later go on to excavate in Afghanistan and Turkmenistan and really would define the BMAC, along with a few other scholars. And he's especially known for his work at Gonur Tepe. So the first inklings of the BMAC that we get, basically the conclusion of years of survey work, is this map. So we talked a little bit earlier about excavation, which is very much kind of the main thing people know about when they think archaeology. You think people digging holes, finding ancient things. But one very important archaeological technique is survey. And survey doesn't give you the time depth that excavation does, because all you're doing is looking at what can be seen on the surface. And this is important in just figuring out the spatial context of sites. Like, not only do you want to know the relationship of different artifacts within things like buildings and within neighborhoods, but you want to know the way that, say an ancient city interacts with what's around it. So here, what they get is, so this whole area is one kind of large ancient oasis, and then they divide it into 9 micro oases. And it's not as clear on this map. This one's a bit bigger. As you can see, they have enlarged one dot that it corresponds to 1 dot per micro oasis. And these sites are larger than everything that's around them. So based on that, and also how more recent cities work, especially pre-industrial cities or non-industrial, it seems to be that when you get a large town or small city and then just a bunch of village sites around it, it's generally taken by archaeologists to mean that this, so here's Togalok. So that's the site that I work at if we ever get to do international travel again. Likely this site is in charge to some degree over these small village sites around it. So likely what's happening is that people in the village are largely subsistence farmers. They produce some kind of excess and likely pay at least some of it to this site, Togalok, in taxes or something like that. And ultimately, all of these are kind of orbiting around this much larger site of Gonur Tepe, which is, so each of these sites with the large dot are about 8 to 10 times that size of a village, which the village sites here aren't very large. They're the size of 2 to 3 football fields, so it's quite compact. And then Gonur is about 4 times the size of each of these. So it's massive for the area, still quite small overall. And this is, ultimately, this is the type of thing you get from archaeological survey. Also in these initial surveys, it seemed to be that sites here along the western edge were older than sites over on the eastern edge, although that is difficult to actually determine with survey, since again, it's just finding what is on the surface and not actually telling you what is older or what is younger. So once they really start digging, what they find are things like this. So this is the North Mound at Gonurdepe, which is again, the largest of all of these BMAC Oxus sites. And again, this is all in the Turkmenistan region. We're not dealing with the other sort of half of it. This is the southern part of Gonur. So both massive for the region complexes. Here you can see a large fortification wall that runs around the whole site, and then you have an interior one that they call this area the fort or Kremlin. It tends to be also just maintained as Kremlin in sort of English language publications about it, not just the Russian ones, which is an interesting choice in the field, I think, but it's what we do. Here we also have this fortified monumental wall in the middle, and then you have one surrounding the whole site. And what they find within there are things like this. So this is an axe made out of bronze. This is a silver cup, camel pin. So ultimately, there's a question of what the context for this is. We don't have written records like produced by the people of the BMAC. Some people contend that they might correspond to certain things in Mesopotamian texts, but it's really unclear. When Sarianidi is finding this, the only things that really look like this that are clearly from this same culture are some isolated finds in Iran, a few of them which were discovered by R.L. Stein, and there are also a few in Pakistan and North India. So ultimately, how does Sarianidi interpret this? The easiest narrative, especially coming from the Soviet tradition of really looking for the origins of various groups, is to place it in the context of sort of this idea of the Indo-Iranian people. So Indo-Iranian languages it's a subfamily it's a branch of Indo-European basically. And importantly for this, it includes the historical languages of Vedic Sanskrit and Old Avestan. So you have Indian religious texts that are written in Sanskrit and Iranian, ancient Iranian, like pre-Islamic Iranian religious texts that are written in Avestan. And this gives it a lot of context. So to just kind of pause there a moment, Indo-European languages are spoken in this wide variety of places. So not only does calling or determining that the BMAC is part of the Indo-Iranian, not just language family, but cultural group, which is really what Sarianidi will argue. It both gives context to understand the BMAC, and it also solves a lot of deeper problems within archaeology and ancient history. So I will preface this by saying I am not a linguist. I don't actually know how all of this works, but basically all of the variously colored areas here speak primarily Indo-European languages, and there are various subgroupings. So over here we have the Romance languages like French and Spanish. Here we have Germanic languages like German, and also English and the Nordic languages. And then we have Slavic languages kind of going up and to the north through Russia, Russia being the largest, I believe, Slavic language. And then this blue is the Indo-Iranian family. So it includes modern Farsi, which is, or Persian, also Hindi, several smaller languages spoken sort of in the, I guess, in Pakistan and sort of these frontier regions of Pakistan, like, so Urdu, also Indo-European, some of the languages of Afghanistan, and did I say modern Kurdish? Kurdish is also Indo-Iranian. And ultimately, making the BMAC who lives here, which is, it's now a Turkic-speaking country, but ultimately what becomes important for various reasons is the notion that it might have at one point been Indo-Iranian. Indo-European speakers don't appear to originally be from this region. They seem to be, there's one hypothesis that they're from Anatolia, possibly up in the Pontic region, but they're from like somewhere kind of over near the border of Europe and Asia. So a question that comes up in archaeology is, well, why does North India speak an Indo-European language? And there have been various theories of this kind of Indo-Iranian or Indo-Aryan conquest, which then you get into the Harappan civilization and its own thing. But what Sarianidi will argue, is that what we're seeing is an Indo-Iranian migration. So up here in Anatolia, we actually have, that's where we have in evidence the oldest Indo-European language, which is Hittite, the language of the Hittite Empire. And Sarianidi believes that essentially after the collapse of the Hittite Empire, some people from here start moving through, as they go through the Near East, they become the Mitanni and continue on their way and become the people, go back both up to Margiana and over to Bactria, as well as another group going there. But they essentially become the peoples of the BMAC. And this fits in with this idea that each site of the BMAC is basically one main period, and that things that are older are in the west and things that are younger in the east. He largely tracks this through stylistic things, so he sees these kind of Syro-Hittite style images that appear frequently on seals and connects them with similar things in Margiana and Bactria. So here we're dealing with stamp seals. So in general, you use seals they use them almost like a signature or to guarantee that something hasn't been opened. So you might, like if you have a jar of something, you cover it in like the seal between the jar lid and the jar. You put clay there and then you stamp it. And then if the stamp is intact when the recipient gets it, they know it hasn't been opened. But if it's broken, then someone has been tampering with it. So here we have a stamp seal. And these, they're called compartmental seals, are very common of the BMAC. You can see they have like these big blank spaces that doesn't really happen actually in the Middle East, so it's very particular. But Sarianidi sees this imagery being very similar to, say, this Mitanni seal, in that we have this figure. There seems to be some kind of feather thing going on, and he's conquering these, I believe they're lions, And he sees that as being similar to this motif, where you have this eagle hero in battle with these snakes. Similarly, you have frequent things of this, what Sarianidi believes to have been a goddess figure conquering the snakes, and also sees it similar to this scene, which Sarianidi wants to be an acrobatic scene, which might make sense with the drums and then figures jumping over pikes or are on pikes. It's kind of unclear, but once you connect this with these ideas of being Indo-Iranian, then it starts to make sense because you can see these connections. He also believes a lot of these monumental structures that have evidence of burning and fire were fire temples. So Zoroastrianism is the traditional religion of Iran from the pre-Islamic period, and within that tradition, a lot of rituals involve fire and things like purity and the purity of the things that you're burning for the sacred fire, and keeping the ashes when you're done with them pure are very important. So Sarianidi sees structures like this that have maybe some kind of altar thing going on, that there seems to be evidence of burning, and also there are frequently layers of very clean white ashes in them. He connects that with later Zoroastrian practice. He also sees evidence of a hallucinogenic drink that he calls soma haoma, which appears both in Avestan texts, which the Avesta is very important in early Zoroastrianism, and also in some Vedic Indian sacred texts. And he names it after them. I can't remember which is which. In one place, the drink is called soma, and in the other, it's called haoma. But he gets that from finding these rooms within structures he's identified as temples that have jars and roughly this repertoire of goods that he sees as these sacred vessels. And he claims to have found evidence of remnants of hemp and ephedra in them, which he takes for evidence of having made this drink. And you also have these bone tubes, which Sarianidi believes to have been used to drink this beverage, and also their form recalls their purpose because they're for this hallucinogenic drink consumed during ritual. And then also they have these large eyes that imitate, in a somewhat crude form, the dilation of the pupil that would presumably occur if you drank this drink. He also sees evidence of the Zoroastrian worldview, which is very connected to dualities in these sacred vessels, where you have basically clean animals and humans on the top, so essentially like mammals and birds, and then you have these snakes and frogs and kind of creeping things that are all either like facing downward or headed downward, or just in the lowest register of the vessel, which relates to sort of pure and impure creatures in a Zoroastrian worldview. And this narrative does make sense, and it does give it has a lot of explanatory power. It takes these somewhat isolated things and puts them all together and gives them context. And this view, however, would be challenged as more and more scholars became interested in the BMAC, particularly in the late 80s and early 90s and continuing through today. And a lot of these new scholars interested in the BMAC come from a Western and specifically American archaeological tradition, which is in many ways very different from the Russian one, which is still very much tied in with the Soviet just archaeological interests. And by the 1980s, when people who would become important in this kind of field of Oxus study were being trained or having their early careers, you really see most Westerners aren't particularly interested in migration and don't really favor it as an explanatory model for culture change. It's not necessarily wrong, but it's just kind of out of fashion. And there's also, especially in American archaeology, a fairly deep skepticism of looking for instances of ethnogenesis. So in the US, archaeology is a part of the broader field of anthropology, and one of the foundational figures was actually a German man, Franz Boas. And one of his key insights was that race, language, and culture can vary separately from one another. It's not really that speaking Indo-Iranian means you are part of an ethnic group of Indo-Iranians, which means you have certain cultural practices that are noticeably Indo-Iranian, but that these things may intersect, but aren't necessarily one-to-one. For example, like I could move my family to Uzbekistan, and it doesn't mean I will look like an Uzbek. I have a very rudimentary grasp of the language, and I'd be culturally distinct, but say my children and my children's children would ultimately assimilate to this culture, but possibly also still look a bit like me and stand out. And you have, and like that's a very crude version of it, but you have these instances where various boundaries are really malleable. And there's also a certain hesitancy to assume very long cultural continuities and kind of take contemporary things as being just being projected into the past. So doing things like Sarianidi did with looking at modern and historic Zoroastrian ritual and then projecting it back an extra 2,000 years. So ultimately, this newer group of scholars, which many Russian scholars are still somewhat tied to Sarianidi's beliefs, although it's, you know, not required. And there are plenty of Westerners that also believe a lot of the things Sarianidi says, so it's not a super black and white difference. But overall, it's more common in the West that people are more persuaded by this idea that the BMAC is actually a local origin. While the, you know, Margiana itself is there, ultimately the people who settle there are coming from this Kopet Dagh region, so the Kopet mountain range, and people had been settled for hundreds of years in the foothills, and just the BMAC is a group of those people moving into these oasis environments, possibly with an environmental downturn. And later excavations do seem to have shown a lot of this, and more careful excavations. So as much as Sarianidi, we are not quite as treasure hunty as we were in about 1900, but Sarianidi uses very aggressive excavation techniques. You don't uncover entire sites when you're being careful, essentially. So he did bring in bulldozers and things and assumed that every site was basically one period. But even when you're at the same sites, if you go through carefully, you can delineate that there are actually two periods of the Oxus civilization and not just one, and that you're not getting everything in the West is settled and then people are pushing east, there are older and younger settlements at various sites. So a lot of it seems to be settled at roughly the same time. They also did more carbon dating, and once you correct the dates so that radiocarbon correction is a complicated thing on its own. But basically, once you correct the dates knowing that the amount of carbon, the ratios of carbon change over time, you start to see that, first of all, settlement in the oases is older than Sarianidi initially thought, and also that the settlement in Bactria Margiana in here is older than Iran. So people came and settled in here, and then you get their goods in Iran, because then later they either individuals moved to Iran or they later traded it. They also question the real evidence for Zoroastrian related rituals. And this one's kind of difficult because it's an argument over saying, I don't think you proved your argument. There have been some later studies of these supposed ritual vessels that seem to contain grain and not hallucinogenic things. And there's also some degree to which not every fire means that you're in a fire temple, and not even every fire in a temple means it was a fire temple. People need to cook. Like, it gets quite cold at night. They could just have heaters. And then also, this is a Sasanian period fire temple. And there's a degree to which this temple form doesn't actually resemble this much later temple form, which is somewhat to be expected. But it just seems to be that there are more breaks in this tradition than continuities. People have also criticized the looking at iconography and using that to reconstruct people movements from here all the way to here, because ultimately a lot of these images are very common in this entire area, what scholars now call the Middle Asian interaction sphere. And they may just be coincidental things, but because people are in this region and interacting, ideas move without people on a broad scale moving. And even if some individuals might move, it's not quite the same as this mass migration or conquest type migratory model. For example, in a similar period, I know it appears that here in Mesopotamia, we have at least one household where people from the Indus over here live. And there's just like a family from the Indus who lives there, and they make Indus style beads. It's not that a bunch of people from here moved to here, but that someone saw a better opportunity. And similar things could be happening in getting these Oxus style goods into Iran. You don't need one group coming either through here or there and then spreading out to there. You just need a handful of people carrying their cultural goods with them to explain it. So yeah, I guess in summary, it's not really the best summary, because a lot of the work that has now been done on the BMAC is just questioning a lot of the assertions that were made in the 1990s and even early 2000s. But I guess for a more general audience, I mean, archaeologists ultimately learn about the past through material culture and also through interaction with each other. And new interpretations aren't necessarily just because new data is found, but because new scholars come and bring with them different perspectives to add to that old data. And ultimately, it's very important to keep in mind people's backgrounds and their kind of various foci and just the stories they want to tell with the data in understanding where interpretations come from and being able to really critically evaluate them. And yeah, thank you all for your attention, and I guess we will leave it open for a Q&A session.
She definitely is not will not be asked to join the free teaching company.
All right, so I have given everybody the ability to unmute themselves now. So if you have any questions, now is a good time to ask them.
And certainly if you want to ask a question and turn your video on, that would work. I think we've gotten through the presentation, so.
Yeah. Although people don't have questions, I have more pretty pictures to show people if people just want to look at pretty pictures. That's also possible.
I was just wondering, this is Nicole, how did you become interested in this area as far as your focus of study? You may have said that at the beginning of the presentation, but if you could kind of talk about that again.
Oh, no, I don't believe I actually did. So I started out actually doing Mesopotamian archaeology, and just actually going back further, when I did my undergrad, one of my advisors focused on the Indus civilization on the Indian subcontinent, largely in Pakistan. And so you get a lot of interest in the BMAC when you do Indus studies. So I had some familiar with it, but I came to UChicago to look at Mesopotamia. But when it came time for me to choose a dissertation topic a couple of years ago, when, you know, we were hopeful that a lot of the Middle East would open more for field work, and then it seemed to just be closing more and more. My advisor asked, like, would you be interested in shifting your focus to Central Asia? And yeah, and I kind of leapt on that, and it's, you know, it was always something that, you know, interested me, and it was kind of always on the periphery of what I was doing. So I really decided to, yeah, just get into that. Also, if you'll all excuse me for 1 second, I'm going to turn on my light. Sorry about that. So do we have another question?
I have a question. When they decide to look at the sites, they start at the site which is already in exploration, or you go new site. How they decide where to look, choose the site?
Yeah, so I mean, different people do different things. So as I was talking about with that initial like survey that they did back in the 50s, they started locating where some of the larger and smaller sites are, and some of the sites like the larger, so I work at, or worked, or will work, hopefully if I get to travel again, at Togalak 1, which is a reasonably large site for the region, and so there's a little bit of an artificial mound. So the site is actually, it goes up a few meters taller than the plain that's around it. So a lot of what they do on survey, especially one as large as the ones they're doing in the 50s, is you have people either walk or sometimes just, ride around in jeeps and look at things. So you start mapping where the major sites are. They also, especially with Sarianidi's first excavations, he kind of did a sampling of the larger sites. So he did do a few trenches at Togalok and at a few other ones before really zeroing in on Gonur. And that was basically, they had determined that this was the biggest, most impressive site, and he decided he was just going to dig the biggest, most impressive site. So they frequently use survey as a way of just seeing what's there, and then you choose, given all of the permits and resources you could ever want, you just kind of choose the one you want. Now it depends very much on getting the proper permits and what various bureaucrats want dug by what people. Is kind of also the background non-scholarly part of it.
I was watching a program on TV in Science Channel that they located in South America, further down of Peru and all that. That with the satellite, they saw some weird thing in the area, like something is there, they should look what it is. And then they sent the people there, and they found some white covered architecture there on the ground underneath. And then they traveled and found some lady, old time, and they said there was a salt lake there where water was so high concentration it would clear out everything, and that's how the town disappeared. It's very interesting how they find things where they are what.
Yeah, and they definitely do that more now. So the now unfortunately named Corona satellite program was a US spy program.
Right.
And like a number of years back, they finally declassified all the images. So now archaeologists do go and you look through images and try to see if you can identify a site or if you can identify something that doesn't look right, and then you normally have a season on the ground to go and see what that is.
Right.
I'm pretty sure by the 50s, most of that is all still classified, and you're getting, I know for a while was it the Corona program or a different one? For a while, they just had people with cameras fly, they had spy planes fly over and then take pictures on film, and then you would have to get a plane to go in and try to catch the film as dropped from another plane. And
right.
It was, a lot of crazy things. But especially you can also get, okay resolution with some more recent things. And sometimes with Google Earth, really large sites, you can see these ones you have to have fairly good resolution in your images just because they're comparatively low to the ground.
Right.
Compared to a place like Mesopotamia where you can get sites that are just 15-20 meters tall.
Thank you.
Yep.
I have a question that's sort of related to that. So you mentioned that the sites tend to be lower, like you don't have these high tells like you see in Mesopotamia. Do you know why that is?
A lot of it is just especially with the BMAC, they're just not occupied for as long, right? Because the tell formation tends to just accumulate frequently, Tel Brak, which is a site in Syria, which I don't know if you've actually seen pictures of it, Emily, but yeah, it's massive, but it's because it just remains settled for a few thousand years. And also you're not like, I know very much in Mesopotamia, the tradition is when you want a new house, you collapse the mud brick, rake it flat, and then build a new house on top of the remnants of your old one. I don't think we can really say if that's what people are doing here, or know if that is their tradition, or if they actually like cart things away. So a lot of it is unknown, but ultimately these sites go from 2300-ish to about 1500-ish BC. And then most of the occupation in this region is very ephemeral nomadic occupations. So they're just not building these giant structures anymore.
Thank you.
Yep.
I have a question for you about India and the language.
Okay.
What is your reasoning today about the language, the Western language in the India region?
I mean, I wouldn't say it's necessarily a Western language, but that it's related to this larger language family. And I think it remains an issue in sort of history and archaeology, the question of why Indo-European languages are spoken in such a broad region. And I think most people do think there was a certain amount of migration that happened to bring in basically these older I guess technically they're called Indo-Aryan languages when you get to India, but the nature of that movement is still unclear. People used to believe that there was this kind of basically a horse riding warrior elite that comes in and basically destroys the Indus civilization, but it doesn't seem to have been an actual violent conquest. So probably you're just having people slowly move in. And, it's very possible that the people of the Oxus did speak an Indo-Iranian language, but it's also possible they didn't. We just can't really know unless we find, something they wrote down. Like we know Hittites spoke an Indo-European language because they wrote it down. We know that later texts that appear sort of in adjacent regions, like I think I want to say the earliest sort of Indian texts that we can read are in an Indo-European language. And also we know in Iran they speak an Indo-European language at least by, when the Persians come in, probably around 800 BC. But yeah, so probably there's a decent amount of people movement. It's just very unclear what the nature of it was and what peoples were actually moving and where and why. I think we need to do more research before we can actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions? And if you guys think of anything later, always happy to connect you with Teagan, pass on questions to her. So that's always going to be an option.
I will also, as I mentioned, I know I just said the email address. Hopefully it's, the benefit of series being a short maybe a long title if we say it all out, but as the acronym, series at uchicago.edu is a great way to get in touch with us, and we can certainly pass along any kind of questions to Teagan that way as well. So.
Thank you.
Is there any last questions, or?
Nope.
I know Teagan has some extra images. Would people be interested in seeing some of those images as a way to close out the evening?
Yeah, I would be interested in that.
Okay, let me just refigure out my screen share. Okay, can you all see my PowerPoint again?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Oh, I clicked the
There we
image,
go.
but I did not click share. Okay, so this, I think this is really cool. It's a flower. I can't tell if this is shell or ivory. It might be shell with a little gold center. It might take it a minute. Some of these images are, you know, larger than is ideal. Oh. So here we have, I think this is largely stone in a necklace. A lot of these are found just as beads, and then they restring them essentially to demonstrate. This is my new favorite thing. It's an axe that looks like a chicken head, which I actually just found in choosing my cool pictures earlier today. Another axe, gold bullhead. Yeah, it's very unclear what exactly that object, like what its function was. Probably just to be pretty. It's another stamp seal. Another ceremonial axe. So all of the axes that I've actually shown are ceremonial. You can kind of tell like the edge here is just rounded. So they're not actually used. Also, because it would be really expensive to put gold on a thing you then like went into a fight with. Freeze. More beads. Again, the string is gonna be modern. I think these are all ivories, and you actually have this like concentric circles with a dot. It's just a common motif that you see. I'm not really sure what it's about. It kind of looks like those evil eye beads that you see in the Middle East to me, but I guess we don't really know. This is another compartmented seal. It's made out of bronze. So this is a different kind of seal. It's a cylinder, so you roll it on clay. This is what's very common, like in Mesopotamia. But this is a slightly different style. You don't normally get like this. I'm not even sure if it's a flower shape or a sun shape in Mesopotamia, so its imagery is still fairly distinctive. This is one of the figurines like I showed at the beginning. So you actually have like, this is made as a base, and like the head can be basically pulled out because it's a separate piece. So they're kind of these composite things, and like the last one had a headdress on, and this one, like that's been taken off. Another vessel, you can see you have like snakes kind of coming down and coming up sort of at the bottom, but then you have some kind of four-legged creatures here. That one kind of looks like a dog. So this is a stone bowl. Some people assume that this is a kind of flower. I've heard people talk about it as a poppy. Then you have these miniature stone columns that they're very fine ground stone, and they're about maybe 2 feet tall. We're not really sure what they're about. So this region also, they basically don't have stone that appears there naturally, so they're bringing in these stones, and then they just make them into columns. This is a metal bowl. You can't really see the design on it, but this is the design inside that metal bowl. It's a lot of animal motifs. It's a bead made out of, I think it's agate is the stone with then gold sides. These are just small, possibly cosmetic vessels, so like something you would keep like makeup in, essentially, like kohl for eyeliner. It's a gold bowl. You can kind of see this Bactrian camel. So it's a kind of camel with 2 humps, not 1 hump, which is a dromedary, which are more desert camels, whereas these ones live on the steppe. And then here's the original frieze, and then a drawing of what it looked like. So it's this kind of lion griffin looking thing. Yeah, and here's another earring and necklace. It's not common to see people wearing archaeological artifacts, particularly in color photos. It's a thing that was done very commonly in early archaeology, and then we kind of decided not to do it, but Sarianidi apparently disagreed. And then again, I think that's the same earring, just in closer view. More, again, I'm pretty sure these are shell. They're not, a lot of this publication isn't the best stone. They could also be just a very fine white stone. And then, yeah, this little figurine with reconstruction. So we have these kind of gold plates that would have probably been a skirt. Yeah, and these more decorative objects. It's kind of like a scepter looking thing in like a thin gold, and then the goat in gold, and then a carved panther of some sort. These are ivory that's been discolored, so the snake figure. And these are largely geometric shapes, this kind of nail shape. Another like cosmetic container. All these images are appearing a little more squat than their originals in the PowerPoint. Don't know why, but yeah. So this is almost certainly for, I would imagine, kohl. So you use it as like an eyeliner, and then you have the applicator stick, and then yeah, like a crushed powder inside. Then another one, you can kind of see there's like a snake going up there. Not quite sure what that shape is. Yeah, and I think that's all I had. And all of these are from Gonur, which is that largest site. Most of what we know is all from Gonur. It's only been minimal work that's been done elsewhere, which is part of the reason we don't fully understand the BMAC. We found the impressive stuff, but there's surely a lot more to uncover that will help us actually understand the sort of what and why people are doing in this region. Did anyone have any other questions that come up? Any questions about the new, either something I said in the presentation or the new pictures of anything? Do I need to go back to anyone?
There were some beads that you had in the beginning that looked like they were fired from glass. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh yeah, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, hold on. Now my PowerPoint's mad at me because I went all the way to the end. Yeah, let me find it and I'll do a share screen again. Okay. Let me see. Okay, so now we're You're talking about,
Yeah, almost there.
yeah.
That.
These ones are different. These ones? Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
So
Yeah.
these.
Yeah, so I
Aren't
think,
they made from glass?
no, so I believe that the red is, I believe it's carnelian, and the blue is probably lapis or another lapis-like stone. I'm not entirely sure what that is. The one in the middle, I think it might be a copper or bronze bead that has become discolored, and that's where you get the green color. Yeah, they're not so sort of, it doesn't seem to be that glass making is something that's really done in the BMAC that we know about.
Would it have been in trade?
Possibly. Mostly you get glass in later periods. You get, I think, like towards the end of what would be the sort of BMAC period, you might be getting small amounts in Mesopotamia, but these, I guess it could be faience, which is it's related to glass. I think some of what makes it look like glass is just how glossy the initial photo was. I'm pretty sure these are stone beads.
Why did these people leave? Did they just die out?
Yeah, I mean, that one's a bit unclear, but it does seem to be that towards the end of this period, you get a lot more interaction with nomadic groups from the steppe, and a lot of people put forth that there was an environmental change, and so it became less viable to live in, I mean, what was an oasis, but which can quickly revert back to desert. So that they just kind of, they had these trading contacts north, and then when they could no longer be where they are and farm, they just also decided to become nomadic and moved north. And you also do get, like I said, some similar looking things, especially in graves in Iran. So it's possible that some of them moved out that way. But I think the most convincing reason anyone's come up with is environmental shift, and possibly some issues with water and water management.
That was my next question. Where was the closest water?
So at the time, the area seems to be largely an oasis within the desert. So if we go back to here, maybe if I end slideshow, it'll be faster. Come on. And then restart. So if we go back here, so we're talking about, so it's called the Oxus Civilization because the Amudarya here is the ancient Oxus River, or the river that's known as the Oxus in like Greek texts. So this is their nearest large waterway. And then they start doing irrigation. So they're digging canals for themselves to bring water in order to be able to have crops in a relatively dry region. So I know some people who are actually dealing with the issue of like water management and figuring out where different sort of canals and smaller waterways were in this period. So it's still, like everything with this, a bit in its infancy, but they're definitely at least making artificial waterways for themselves at this time. So it's exactly where they are in relationship to a given settlement is still a bit unclear. But it's they don't go super far from the river. Other questions?
I have one more. Where
yeah.
did they get their gold?
Yeah, so basically everything they got had to be imported. So in this region here, like they had bone because they kept livestock, and they had dirt to make ceramics. So they had clay and they had bone, and everything else had to be imported. So I think you get precious or semi-precious stones kind of from down in Afghanistan. I want to say there's a gold source also in these hills, or else there are some further to the north. But things had to be imported at great distance. I'm not actually sure if there's so with some stones, they only occur in certain environments. So you can do a lot of very specific analyses that will tell you what place like a specific piece came from. I'm not sure if you can quite do that with gold, but they definitely have contacts going south. So there's actually a site down in, I believe it must be now in Afghanistan, that was like a mixed sort of Indus site with BMAC things. So they're certainly trading down with the Indus River Valley in Pakistan. That also uses a lot of precious metals and gold. So it's not always clear if they're getting things directly from the source or if it goes in a more roundabout way.
How do they pay though for everything that's coming in?
Well, I mean, it's largely just based on trading somewhat in kind. So like these objects are manufactured in Bargiana, so by the Oxus, and then they're traded elsewhere. So what they're probably doing is taking in a lot of raw materials, and sort of in exchange, they're essentially selling or trading finished goods. So these, you actually see them less in the Oxus itself and more as trade goods. Again, you get a lot of BMAC stuff in the Indus and in Iran, both Eastern Iran and a bit in Western Iran. It's less common in Mesopotamia, but they're definitely part of a broad trading sphere where essentially they don't really have currency, but you trade either raw materials or finished goods. You can also trade like foodstuffs, but they tend to be very heavy and hard to transport. You might be able to do that if you had like a boat system, but I kind of doubt that that's what they were trading. I would imagine it was mostly, like I said, bringing in raw materials, sending out finished goods. Yeah. Also bronze, like they have quite advanced bronze casting for the time period. So I'm sure like a lot of those could be traded as luxury goods.
Is it safe to be in this area?
Turkmenistan. So Turkmenistan is it's a very closed country, and you know, it has some issues that are common to a lot of post-Soviet countries in that you know, its elections may be less democratic than you would like, but it's very like it's quite low crime. However, they like right now in a pandemic, it is unclear because while they claim to have no cases of coronavirus, you're also not allowed to talk about it, and it's unclear if this is, you know, the truth and they just close their country really fast, or you know, if everyone's sick and they're just not telling the truth about it. So like disease wise, I wouldn't trust it, but as far as like, you know, you're not gonna get mugged walking down the street or kidnapped or anything like that.
Or shot?
No, I don't even know if they're allowed to have guns. Although one thing as a foreigner, like you do kind of have a government minder when you're over there. So like normally in archaeology, there's a government representative that just kind of hangs around to like make sure you're not stealing things or like trafficking in antiquities. In Turkmenistan, the government rep just hangs out with you more and cares more about where you're going, like on days off and things like that. Though that being said, last time I was there, when we were on our way out, like we just got to spend like a day or so in Ashgabat, and no one was really paying that much attention. It was more like, we're like, okay, we're gonna go to the bazaar and then we're gonna go to the museum, and as long as like we made it to the museum when we said we would, like it's not like he had to watch us every moment. Yeah, so it's safe that way. It's less safe if you're like a political dissident or something like that.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Well, unless there's any other questions, I think this would be a good time. I know we've a little bit longer than we had originally scheduled, so I want to thank Teagan for presenting this, and also thank Liz for hosting us through the Barrington Area Library. I don't know, Liz, did you want to say anything in closing?
I just wanted to thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Teagan, and thank you, Esther. This was a great program, and we really appreciated having you.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for allowing me to present as well as Ceres for letting me present too.
So I will, I think that's a good place to say goodnight, and hope everyone has a good good end to the week and start to the weekend. So I hope you, if you're in Chicago, I hope you enjoy what looks like some actual decent weather coming our way. So thank you, and I hope everyone has a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night.